Hello everyone, and welcome to the LEX webinar entitled The CONSER Standard Record, Where Are We Now? My name is Cindy Hepfer, and I am a member of the LEX Continuing Education Committee. Today's presenter is my friend Steve Shadle, Serials Access Librarian at the University of Washington Libraries. Steve co-developed the eSerials Cataloging Workshop for the Serials Cataloging Cooperative Training Program known as SCCTP, and frequently serves as a trainer for SCCTP courses. Early in his career, he was an ISSN cataloger at the U.S. ISSN Center at the Library of Congress, and he was also head of technical services at the U.S. Agency for International Development Library. Steve was the 2010 recipient of the Ulrich Serials Librarianship Award and is currently NASIG president. If you have questions about the CONSER Standard Record, please type them into the question box on your screen. Steve will answer questions periodically throughout the presentation. Today's session is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. A copy of Steve's slides will also be provided. There will be a slight pause as the presentation is turned over to Steve.
Okay, can everyone, hold on a second, let me get this into display mode. I assume everyone can hear me now.
I can hear you, Steve, and now I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so my name is Steve Shadle, and as Cindy said, I'm the Serials Access Librarian at the University of Washington. The reason that I'm giving this presentation, one of the reasons, is because I was on the original working group that put together what was then the access level record and is now called the CONSER Standard Record. So what I'm hoping we'll be able to do today is, or what my intention is to provide an overview of the rationale and the development of the CONSER Standard Record, show some examples of its implementation and its current use, and talk a little bit about the CONSER Standard Record in the context of RDA implementation. Essentially go over the some decisions that were made at the most recent CONSER operations meeting, which happened this last May. So those of you who are actually attending the meeting, I don't know why you're sitting in on this presentation. I hope it'll be useful for those of you who weren't there. I'd also like to ask for your patience. What I've done in this presentation, I've done something a little different than I've done in the past, which is about every 5 or 10 slides, I've just popped in a little question slide like the one you're looking at now to force me. I tend to barrel through presentations, so that's the point at which I'll go ahead and stop and answer any questions that have come up at that point. Okay, so go ahead and type your questions in as you go, and then probably, like I said, about every 5 or 10 slides, I'll go ahead and stop and answer questions. So the original objectives in the creation of the access level record. What had happened was back in 2005, the Library of Congress had come up, come up with what they referred to as an access level record for remote access electronic resources. At that time, they were discovering it was taking a long time to catalog internet resources. And so they took an approach of identifying the elements in the electronic resource record and going through a process of trying to identify the most important elements and have their catalogers focus on those elements. The Library of Congress thought it was a successful model at the time, and so CONSER went ahead and picked it up and decided to use that same model and produce similar objectives for working with serial records. So what we were hoping to do at the time was to create a single standard record that would replace several levels of CONSER records. At that point, we had, let's see, I think four encoding levels, 4 or 5 encoding levels that were fairly common with CONSER records. We wanted to minimize those and minimize any confusion associated with those. The intention was, and you're going to hear this phrase a couple times, and I do apologize for those of you who have been involved in this a lot. You're just going to continue to hear the phrase. One of the objectives was to create a floor record that could then be added to by individual libraries. So to create a minimal set of elements that would be required or required if applicable, if you're used to looking at those mark coding tables. There are a couple elements that are actually a different practice from what AACR2 and CONSER practice previously had been, and we'll take a look at some examples of those. But in most cases, the decision point is whether or not to actually create a specific data element. The focus of the activity was going to be on access points. We were not focused on description. And so that was originally it was called the access level record. One of the other objectives is obviously what we wanted this to be cost effective, and that was one of the reasons that that we went into this effort in the first place. Specifically looking at, is it more cost effective to create records, to maintain records, and is it also cost effective to in training? So so that's what we were looking at when we were gathering statistics from catalogers. And the other thing that we, hold on just a second. The other thing that we were concerned about was we wanted whatever we came up with to work well within the existing framework of OCLC, existing ILSs, AACR2 and MARC, whatever we came up with, even though we were looking at data elements sort of individually, we knew that it had to work within a larger framework in our larger environment. So the process was, we hoped to have a structured collaborative process. We built the record structure by evaluating the core set of serial record elements and identified user tasks associated with those elements, and then determined whether each element was a high value or a low value for that Ferber task, and basically pulled out the high values and determined that that was the mandatory element set. One of the other things that we did was we interviewed catalogers for pain points. What are the things that serials catalogers have specific problems with or find unnecessarily difficult or unnecessarily time-consuming? I didn't mention that the original working group, I forgot to track this. I think there were 15 of us altogether, a number from the Library of Congress. It was mostly catalogers, but there were a couple reference staff from the Library of Congress, one systems person. So it was mostly, the original access level group was mostly catalogers with a mix of a few other types in it. So those of us who are from different institutions, we went back to our catalogers and talked to our catalogers about what their pain points were. Then the idea was to take what we'd gotten so far and to brainstorm and develop a set of cataloging guidelines that catalogers could then work from. And then we would test those guidelines via the use of a pilot project. That pilot project involved 13 libraries with 38 catalogers and 88 record reviewers at those 13 libraries. So the mandatory element set that we ended up coming up with, we'll take a look at in a second. How the working group came up with it, as I mentioned, they started with a complete list of serial record elements. Each element was scored either high or low in support of Ferber tasks. And then there were a few elements which were added to support processing processing or shared cataloging efficiency. Things like the 042, the authentication code, where we knew we would have to have some, a specific element in order to support some program activity. We made no change and addressed no changes in terms of name or subject access. Because it was the access level record, there was a perception that one of the failures of the core level record, the core record which had come before this, was the fact that there was a limit on the number of subject headings. That specifically one of the ways to reduce the amount of time catalogers spent on creating a record was to reduce the number of subject headings. And I think that was seen as a failure of the record standard. We didn't want to go that way because we really did want to maximize access and really focus on access. So there was no change in practice for name and subject access. I just wanted to show you, we were working from a chart that probably consisted of about 40 to 50 pages. This is just a little excerpt of the chart which shows the user task. What we're looking at is a specific element, a set of elements. So we're looking at a user task. And this user task had to do with the title of a manifestation, of a serial manifestation, and we put together an example search or a scenario of when a user would use the title of a manifestation, and then went through all of the specific serial data elements associated with that attribute to identify whether they were high value and low value. So for example, a patron is seeking an article in Scientific America and they have a citation that includes the title of the journal. So which title elements are high value and which are low value for supporting that activity? So we went through, like I said, about 40 to 50 pages of these charts. It was a pretty intense activity. And yeah, and we forced ourselves to do high and low so that we really had to make decisions about, the whole medium value thing. Just we knew that we would not make some hard decisions if we didn't force ourselves to do high and low. So I'm not going to go over. What you see now is a summary of the mandatory elements that came out of that review. I'm not going to go over all of these, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them in passing. One of them is the place of publication, because we had originally made a decision based on the review of elements. The place of publication had value in very limited situations and that it really didn't have a universal value. So the first version of the access level record that we went through, we only required a transcription of place of publication in very specific instances. We discovered on review that was pretty much a failure. So then we actually revised that in the process. One of the other things that we discovered in talking with reviewers is that the element that's date and designation, it says all unformatted there. We discovered one of the things that our record reviewers commented on was the fact that the formatted 362 appeared, had the same kind of formatting as a local holding statement. So that oftentimes users would think that the 362 was what that library held. So that's the reason that it says all unformatted there. So we made some decisions about what the formatting of a 362 would look like. And I do also want to mention one other element here. This one that says either series added entry or series statement. Again, because we were focused on access, we felt that the more important element of those two elements was the series added entry, and that a series statement as a descriptive element was only really necessary if the description was not already accounted for in a series authority record. So one of the principles that we looked at, and we looked at a number of principles, and one of the principles was that the bibliographic record we were creating could focus on access, and that some elements of description were more appropriate in an authority record rather than in a bibliographic record. Some of the elements, the summary of the elements that we would omit, meaning that they would not be required elements in the creation of a CONSER record. One of the most significant ones is the second one listed here, the distinguishing uniform titles. What the group identified, what we identified through review was that there were two instances in which the distinguishing uniform title was very important. One was for generic titles, and we wrestled with, how do you define a generic title? And the other one was with monographic series, because the creation of series authority records were not being changed, were not being affected by what we were doing with serial bibliographic records. So if the series authority record required a qualifier, the series title required a qualifier, then we wanted the bibliographic record to be in sync with that. So those were the only two cases where we were actually requiring a 130 or a 240 on a serial record. And we'll see some examples of the rest of these later. Again, I just want to emphasize the fact that this was considered a floor, so that any of these elements could be, or most of these elements could be added by an individual cataloger if that individual cataloger felt that it was important for them in working with that particular title, that particular serial. So at this point, I just want to stop real quickly and see if there are any questions that anyone has. I'll give you just a minute or two to. I see the only thing up there at this point is someone having a problem with muting. Okay, then why don't we go ahead and go on to to talk about the guidelines that we were putting together for catalogers. The point of the guidelines, there were several things we were looking at. One was to eliminate or minimize redundancies in the catalog record. We were also wanted, as part of that process, we hoped that ILS developers, that system developers would develop their systems to more fully display the data that we were putting in records, to better display that data. With the guidelines, we also wanted to provide some specific advice to catalogers to help them expedite decision making. That was part of the issues with looking at their pain points, was to identify what areas that we could provide them with advice on. One of the, and getting back to AACR2, I think one of the most popular features that catalogers love about AACR2 is the fact that some rules have that in case of doubt clause, that if you're having to apply a judgment and you have that in case of doubt clause, then the cataloger who's not sure about what they're doing can feel comfortable applying that clause. And so I think we wanted to take that approach to some degree to help with catalogers who are having to make judgments outside of their normal experience. There was one guideline that we had that never actually came to pass, which we were hoping that in creating something that was a little more of a metadata style that was data elements rather than a description which is buried within AACR2, within an AACR2 context. We were hoping it would be possible for publishers and others to supply some of this data through any number of feeds. I mean, there's been a few pilot and experimental processes here, but we were hoping that really identifying the data elements would allow people to do that. But we haven't really seen that come to pass other than, as I've said, in some pilot projects. One of our other guidelines in making decisions about the standard record was to make the record clearer and cleaner for users so that users can interpret the record easier. In creating the cataloging guidelines and giving instructions to catalogers, we made a point of saying it is not required to, rather than saying don't do this. So you have a set of mandatory elements, and then you have a set of optional elements. So we were saying you don't have to do this, you don't have to, it's not required for you to do this, it's not required for you to do this. Okay, but you can if you want to. So let's take a look at just a couple examples of what the guidelines were trying to address. This is a display from our local Webpack. We're on an Innovative Interfaces Webpack. So those of you who are used to III displays, this display should look very familiar to you. We don't have that distinction between brief and full level displays. We just have a record display. It took me less than 5 minutes to find this example. And this is an example of beating the user over the head with the fact that Prompt, this newsletter, is published by the British Association for Drama Therapists, or somehow associated with the British Association for Drama Therapists. In one screen, we tell the user 5 times, this is associated with the British Association for Drama Therapists. Okay. So this is the kind of duplication that we were attempting to minimize when we talk about duplication. Because if you think about it, unless the cataloger cuts and pastes that name every time a cataloger inputs that name somewhere, there is potential for typos. There's potential for errors to be introduced, and unless there's a real strong need for the name to be represented, and there is. I mean, obviously a subject heading is different than a corporate body added entry. So obviously the name will appear, at least twice in this particular case, at least 3 times, because the publication information as well. But does it really need to appear 5? Another example is, now this same publication, this is looking at a WorldCat local display for the same title where the user has done just a search for the word prompt and then limited it to journals using the format limits that are on the left-hand side. So as you can see, the second entry is the one that the user would be interested in that corresponds to the record we just looked at. And the WorldCat local display only displays the information twice, but it displays it in a way that is pretty obvious for the user who is presented with several records for the same title. They can make the distinction, they can make the identification of which one is the appropriate one. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that we were hoping systems would start, the direction systems would start taking. One of my favorite generic titles is Horizons, because there's so many of them, and it just sounds so space age. And there was actually, I probably shouldn't say this, there was actually when Disney World opened in 1971, there was an actual, or when Epcot opened in 1980, there was actually a ride called Horizons. It just speaks to the future. So anyway, but it's a generic title that's a common generic title that people, that we need identification for. Now it turns out in our innovative system, and I think this is common for a lot of vendor ILSs, if you're doing a search that is strictly a title search or a title phrase search using a generic word, of course you get a lot of entries. Now the point, when you're thinking back to card catalogs, those entries were all organized in some way, and the way that they were organized was typically they were organized using alphabetically by the qualifying element that appeared in a uniform title, if there was no author associated with it. So when ILSs were first being developed, that was sort of a default approach, so that the 130 actually took a pretty, it was quite a useful thing to have in your record, quite a useful element to have in your record if that was being used as the primary way of organizing a display like this. You can see that actually in our catalog, that doesn't work too well, because it's not only a 130 that's being used, but it's also not only a title proper that's being indexed and displayed, but also the subtitle for monographs. So what happens is it's still presented alphabetically, but it's also including subtitles. So then you have a lot more garbage in there than you might expect otherwise. And it doesn't take into account the fact that the horizons should be filed before the titles that are like horizons and styles, at the bottom of that display. So in our particular case, the 130 actually doesn't work very well because of the indexing and display rules that we have instituted in our public catalog. But in any case, and that can vary, then that varies from ILS to ILS. But in any case, if you click on that first horizons, which is going to be all the records that just have the single word horizons as a title entry point, you discover a display that looks sort of similar to that WorldCat local display, where it provides enough information to the user that when they're presented with it, they can make a distinction. And I see, and there's not a 130 in here at all that's being used in these displays. So the 130, and I think in general the 130, the uniform title, is probably being used less and less in public displays compared to its use in the past. So some of the specific instances, and I just wanted to put those up as a couple examples of the kinds of things we were considering when we were coming up with the cataloging guidelines. Now, specifically the guidance for catalogers that we were providing, examples of the guidance that we were providing for catalogers we were providing guidance in establishing corporate headings. For example, whenever catalogers, corporate body headings are very common with serial records, and so instances of corporate bodies that have subordination or have multiple levels of hierarchy, catalogers can spend a lot of time working on that, or what the form of a corporate body heading should be. So we provided some general guidance to help catalogers expedite their decision making on heading creation. We also provided some major minor changes. In 2002, we'd had a revamping of the major minor change rules, title change rules, and so we provided some rules of thumbs for common problematic situations, like a geographic term that appears in a title proper. Is it considered a statement of corporate body or not? And we also provided an analysis of title change. One of the other things that we gave guidance to catalogers on was, and required with the CONSER standard record, was the use of the mandatory use of an unformatted 362. That would typically say began with or ended with or ceased with. I realized when I was looking at my notes yesterday and looking back at the original report, it was using the phrase ended with, and I realized that being the cataloger that I am, I'm still using the phrase ceased with. I don't know which makes more sense to users, so I'll have to think about that again. But in general, the guidance, what we were requiring for catalogers, which is actually a change in practice from AACR2, was to always use an unformatted 362. The reasons for that was it was quicker for catalogers to construct, and it was easier to train catalogers to create that. I always referred to the AACR2 practice, which has been carried over into RDA. as if you have the first issue, you do one thing. If you don't have the first issue, you do a different thing. It's sort of a serials cataloger's secret handshake. You know, it's like when you're looking at a record, if the cataloger really knew their stuff, if they formatted the 362 correctly or not. You know, but it's really an unnecessary cataloger's secret handshake. So, and one of the other things that we provided guidance for on catalogers was which notes are important and which notes are required and which notes aren't, and we hope to limit the number of required notes. So what I wanted to present here was the guidelines that we came up with were some general principles for the cataloger to consider, what is referred to as a metadata application profile, and you're seeing a piece of that here in this display, and a couple of appendices that provided specific instructions dealing with some of the things that I've mentioned, and also some record examples. So what you're looking at here is what we refer to as the metadata application profile. As you can see, it's organized by mark element. This is about 5.5 pages of the most commonly seen data elements that are associated with serial records. So if you think about, I think we were relatively successful with this in the sense that it's 5.5 pages rather than the CONSER editing guide of hundreds of pages. It's something that the cataloger especially either the cataloger who was already experienced but needed a reminder on something, or a new cataloger would have something that would be easy that they could refer to, you know, as they're doing their work, rather than having to go to a more detailed, complex resource. So, as part of the pilot, we had reviewers test the records. So we had reviewers take a look at the records that were created, and they looked at the records in their local systems. Many of the reactions were positive. Here's a quote from one that talked about less clutter, that users don't look at all the extra stuff we put in anyway. Spelling out abbreviations was viewed positively. T period meant nothing to most users, but tome would be a little clearer, or even the V period versus volume. The unformatted 362 was easier for patrons and staff to understand, so a 362 that said began with, rather than just the volume designation in an abbreviated form with a hyphen. And requiring fewer notes resulted in a cleaner record. The critical reaction, there were essentially two reactions that we got. One of them had to do, as I mentioned, when we did the initial test, we didn't require place of publication in the record, and that was a big mistake. There were over half of the reviewers cited the missing place of publication as a significant problem, and that's when we added it back in to the standard record. The other reaction that we had was something along the lines of this. I think this summarizes what a number of different comments. That basically a reference staff person, you know, wants everything in the record to help them with troubleshooting, even though in 99 out of 100 transactions they have with users, the access level record would be sufficient. So I want to make a couple comments on the time savings from the cataloger perspective, and then I'll take a look at questions. Cataloger time data was collected, and we did make a point of reporting it and drawing some conclusions from it, but I will be the very first person to admit that that data was not tested for statistical significance. So I would not say that any of the data that we found was statistically significant or could necessarily be valid. But I would also say that there was a lot of anecdotal evidence from catalogers on time savings. Catalogers specifically reported, and actually still do occasionally if I'm talking with someone about it, the fact that they no longer, with uniform titles, it's like what you had to do with the uniform title prior to the CONSER standard record was you had to determine whether there was an identical title proper already sitting in your database, whether that's OCLC or whether that's your local catalog or whatever. You had to search and check to see whether there was an identical title out there in the bibliographic universe. With the change in practice, what we told people was, okay, you don't have to go out and search for anything. Let us tell you the cases where you are required to provide a uniform title. So that way you don't have to spend all this time searching. You can look at the title and say, okay, if it's this kind of a title, if it's a generic title, meaning it consists of resource type words and or frequency words, then provide a uniform title. Otherwise, you're not required to. One of the other savings that was commented on quite a bit was no longer having to abbreviate according to the AACR2 Appendix B, especially for dates, for months of the year in the 362, but in a few other places as well. The fact that there were a lot of notes which were no longer required, catalogers commented on that, and catalogers commented on the ease of creating the 362. That it was much easier to deal with that than try to remember whether how to create it if they had first issue in hand or not. So let me just take a quick look and pop through some questions here. Has the enhancement of records from Daniel Cancasciato, has the enhancement of records been emphasized? What we were trying to do, I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, Daniel, but what we were trying to do is we were trying to create a set of mandatory elements, and then catalogers could provide additional elements, could enhance the records to a degree if they felt it was important for their users or for their systems. And we'll take a look at a couple of examples of that in a second. Please speak to eliminating U856. So in the cataloging guidelines, let me actually just refer to the map right now, the metadata application profile in the 856. I think the only recommendations we made for that were that generally the 856 subfield U, the URL that appears in there, should be pointing to a publisher's version of the resource, or should be pointing to a version of the resource that's in a trusted archive. We specifically told catalogers not to put in local URLs that somehow are password protected or that are proxied for a specific institution. Anything that's specifically institutional, we didn't want to have included in the 856 field, and we provided that instruction to catalogers. Now, what non-CONSER folks do in terms of machine loads, we have no control over, but in terms of what we were telling CONSER catalogers to do for the CONSER standard record, that was the recommendation. Let's see. Hi, Steve. When are we getting to the CONSER standard record of the future horizons? The CONSER standard record of... Sorry. I think that was a joke from Rhonda. Okay, why assigned low importance? Let me see if I can. I.e., why assigned low importance? That's from Laurel Cochran. I'm not quite sure what the question is there, because all I'm seeing, I'm sorry, but all I'm seeing in this display here is why assigned low importance.
Steve, she asked the question about eliminating the 856U.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so that was part of her earlier question. It was assigned low importance. I think it was assigned high importance in terms of the access activity, the access task, so that if you go through that, those 40 to 50 pages of tables that we worked with, there is further activities that are associated with accessing a resource, and I think those URLs that I mentioned were graded as high for that activity, for that task, but otherwise it was graded low associated with other tasks. Are these guidelines being followed right now? Are they published somewhere? Yes, they are published. And I have links at the end of the presentation that you can go and take a look at them. And I'll take a look at some examples after this slide that shows how they're being followed, how the guidelines are being followed. So why don't we go ahead and head over to our next slide. Okay. So the next set of 3 slides are going to be CONSER level, are going to be recently contributed catalog records created by CONSER institutions that have elements of the CONSER standard record associated with them. And I'll go ahead and just point out those aspects right now. This is a record for a Polish publication, a philosophy journal, it appears to be. We have a few fields up here that are not coded, that they're using the fill character in. Those are not required by the CONSER standard record. This could be, there might be some other publications that have this title, even though it's Polish. It's a fairly generic title, but you see there's no uniform title there. There's a 546 here. 546 is a required when applicable note. But you'll see there's no 043. The only element that's required, the 043 is the coded language. The only time coded language is required is if there's more than, the subfield A is the only element that's required, and because there would be only one language that would be coded as the text of the publication, the Polish, that's already covered by this language. So the cataloger did not include, not an 043 code, an 041 code. Sorry about that. An 041 code, there's no 041 subfield A, Polish, subfield B, English. You'll notice that there is an unformatted 362 that says began with, even though the cataloger does have the first issue in hand. Okay. So there is a certain amount of duplication here, but we had determined that that was acceptable duplication for the reason that it provided consistency in practice. It's like the cataloger will always provide a description based on note, even if they have first issue in hand. It's just a standard element that's provided, and that description based on note will always include a title source, even if the title source is what is defined as the chief source for the resource type. Okay. So that's one example from the Library of Congress. Here's an example from Harvard. Again, we have the fixed field elements that are used to fill characters. Now, the cataloger here actually, according to the standard record, they would be required to provide the subfield A's in these 041s, but they're not required to provide the subfield B, probably because the cataloger is an experienced cataloger who already knew what the code was for summaries. They went ahead and added it, and I think that it's perfectly appropriate, makes a lot of sense. Again, the cataloger had the first issue in hand, so they provided an unformatted 362 and also provided the description based on and the title from title page, and also provided a latest issue consulted. The previous record, the cataloger didn't have a latest issue consulted. When we came up with the first iteration of the guidelines, if a cataloger had one issue in hand, we just assumed that they could do a description based on and leave it at that. But some of the feedback we got indicated that it wasn't that some catalog some users, specifically staff and other catalogers who were less familiar with serial records, were confused because sometimes they would see a latest issue consulted note and sometimes they wouldn't. So they weren't sure whether the omission of a latest issue consulted note was just a mistake or whether that was really on purpose. So then we amended the requirements so that a latest issue consulted was a required element. One of the things I want to point out on this record is the 550 note to support, which is a description to support a corporate body added entry, the issuing body note, is not a required note. And in this case, the cataloger actually did not provide a 550 to justify the 710 that's in the record. In my looking at getting ready for this and looking at a lot of recently contributed CONSER cataloging records, I noticed a lot of catalogers are still providing 550s. They're still providing 260 subfield C dates. They're still filling in the frequency and regularity codes. And that's okay. I mean, if their systems need that information, then, or if they feel it's important for their users, then of course it's perfectly appropriate. The whole floor, not a ceiling thing. But I have noticed that in quite a few records. Here's one last record. In this case, cataloger did not have first issue in hand, but they knew when it began, so they provided the unformatted 362 and provided the description based on for the next issue, and also provided the latest issue consulted. Okay, one of the things I'd like to mention is that one person's floor is another person's ceiling. This is taken from an article that was written by Lori Terrell and was published in Serials Review a couple years ago. And I would like to emphasize that that she does cite that the sample that she looked at was relatively small, but it looked like the initial sample that she pulled really indicated that that catalogers were accepting CONSER standard records as is, and generally not adding elements to them when they brought them into their catalogs. So, as I said, it seems that there was early acceptance of the standard. I apologize for the rather dramatic "When Worlds Collide" titling of this. I'm sure Barbara Tillett is probably not happy right now if she's listening in. But I want to go ahead and talk now. Actually, let me go ahead and I noticed there was one or two questions that popped up. So let me go ahead and take a look at those, and then we'll start in on the RDA portion of this. And I do apologize. I'm going to have to... Are these guidelines being followed right now? Has a study been done on patron discovery of these record types? Not, as far as I know, no studies have been done on patron discovery. The only work that I know of has been when we had the review, when we had staff from different departments within libraries do the reviewing of the records that had been created. As far as I know, that's the only work that's been done. There was no thought, was there any thought of dropping the 362 altogether or making it optional? I don't think it has use for patrons, and all it confuses patrons about library holdings. Now, the 362 is a really important element from, if nothing else, from a processing perspective. From a, what do I need to have in my collection in order to know that I have everything or don't have everything or have missing issues? So if nothing else, from a processing perspective, I know that it's an important issue and would need to be included in records. And also there, if you're talking about universal holdings, who actually has what, it's pretty important to really have it in a union record as well. I'm relatively new cataloging in my institution. How do I know if my institution is a CONSER standard library? The CONSER standard record practice is required to be followed by libraries that are submitting CONSER records. And you can go to the CONSER website and find out a lot more about that, and you'll get a URL for that. Any library can follow the practice when they submit records to OCLC, because CONSER practice is a standard practice that is accepted in OCLC. is the LIC note required all of the time? At this point, yes, it is. It wasn't when we first started working with it. Okay, I think that's the last question there. So we've got about another 10 to 15 minutes. I think we should be able to finish up the RDA section, okay? So what I'd like to end this talk with is talking a little bit about the future of the CONSER standard record, specifically within the context of RDA implementation. When the RDA test happened, there were guidelines that were put together by CONSER for the use of the CONSER standard record as part of RDA testing. And I provided the URL for those guidelines. In general, those guidelines said, and this is just in general, go ahead and code stuff as you would for the CONSER standard record. You know, go ahead and create a uniform title if you're following the CONSER standard record and you want to continue to follow the CONSER standard record for the test. Only create a uniform title, you know, when it's mandatory according to the CONSER standard record. You know, so now I was on the group. I didn't participate, but I was actually on the Continuing Resources Cataloging Committee group that put together that test for serial records. And one of the observations, general observations I have of the people who contributed records to that test was that the people who were already following the CONSER standard record and decided that they were going to continue following the CONSER standard record as part of the RDA test they didn't seem to have a problem with RDA. I mean, they had issues with, there was a learning curve in terms of creating headings that were RDA headings and not AACR2 headings. But in terms of the serial specific elements, they seemed to more or less just sort of breeze through because they were still following the metadata application profile, they were still following the CONSER standard record, and they weren't really using RDA that much to do their serials cataloging. Whereas the people who didn't, the catalogers who didn't follow the CONSER standard record, especially ones who were not experienced serials catalogers, really struggled with creating a serial catalog record according to RDA. And I think that that was part of the reason to create the CONSER standard record documentation, was so that users would only have to go to the full, whether it's AACR2 or RDA, when they really needed to, and not necessarily have that be the thing that they go to all the time. You know, give them a tool that's easy for them to use that can take care of, you know, their documentation support for most of the problems that they see. So that was just an observation I had made in watching the RDA testing from the outside. The areas of divergent practice, and I'll talk more about this in a minute in terms of how CONSER is going to handle these kinds of things, are that the use of the uniform title, the 130 and the 240, when it's added. Also, the use of a translation uniform title, or in RDA, what can be considered a unique expression title. When in what cases do you add a unique expression title, and what does it look like in a record? There's a slight difference in terms of other title information, because those subtitles, other title information is not an RDA core element, but it is required in the CONSER standard record in a very, very small number of cases. The cataloger judges that it will be useful to help with understanding a title proper. There is a more significant difference in terms of statement of responsibility, because statement of responsibility is your 245 subfield C, is a core element in RDA, but is not a required element in the CONSER standard record. The same thing with publication dates. Although there is, in talking about this divergent practice, I'm not talking about the LC policy statements. I'm just talking about RDA versus the CONSER standard record. So publication dates is a similar situation, as is extent and many of the notes that may or may not be required in one cataloging, following one cataloging practice, but not the other. So the thing that I want to end up with here, and then I'll take questions, is at the CONSER operations meeting that happened this last May, there were all of these divergent practices were examined with the operations committee coming up with initial decisions as to how each of them would be handled. So this is a list of all of the current CONSER standard record practices that the decision has been made by CONSER to these practices will be retained after RDA implementation. I should say, or if and when RDA implementation, depending on how much of an optimist you are. Other title information will still only be required for clarification and support of a title proper, but again, as I mentioned, that's not RDA core. Recording of parallel titles will only happen in 246. The parallel title will not be part of a 245 subfield B transcription. Statement of responsibility will continue to not be required in a CONSER standard record. CONSER had come up with a practice of when a frequency changed, frequency is a note that frequency note is tagged as a 310. Originally, the CONSER standard record, we had said we would only keep the current frequency in the record in a 310 and not worry about 321s. But as we talked about it more for some types of materials, those former frequencies are really important, and they are important for publication patterns as well, to help inform the creation of publication patterns. So it was decided that we would keep all former frequencies. So if a frequency changed, the 310 would change to a 321, and the current frequency would go into a 310. RDA talks about, RDA has an option. I don't think it's a specific instruction, but an option to just use a generic phrase that says frequency varies, if the cataloger feels that way. We're saying you're not to use that option in the CONSER standard record. The source of title note, even though it's not always required in RDA, will be required in the CONSER standard record. In the same way with a description based on. Description based on will always be required even if first issue is in hand. And also it will be required using the existing CONSER wording, which is description based on, and then the volume, the issue numbering and date. The wording in RDA is different for that note, but it's not prescriptive. It's only meant to be an example. So the CONSER, in that sense, the CONSER practice is within RDA, but it's the fact that catalogers will always provide it. Extent will only be required for tangible non-print formats. So things like your CD-ROMs, your diskettes, your video cassettes are the only things that will require an extent statement in the CONSER standard record after RDA implementation. The PCC, not just the CONSER operations folks, but the entire program for cooperative cataloging, made a decision to continue to allow the provider neutral practice, which means only one record is created for an online version, even if it is available from different providers. So different providers are listed in separate 856s, but there's only one catalog record created for the online version. And there's more. You can go to the CONSER website and go to the PCC website and see more about the provider neutral practice if you have any questions about that. Same way with the single record approach. The single record approach will still be allowed by the program for cooperative cataloging. But what the program for cooperative cataloging decided to do was to take a look at a few issues associated with the single record approach. They wanted to clarify that the single record approach, and the single record approach is basically taking the print version record and adding an 856 to it to provide a link to the online version of that print resource, and also providing a note to that effect that the online resource is available. The PCC indicated that they would clarify the current guidelines so that the single record approach would only be applied to a textual manifestation, and also clarify that on that print version record, on that record for a textual thing, a print version, that the 33X field would only contain elements for the text describing the textual version, And also the same situation with the 007 field, that the 007, there would be no 007 that represents the electronic version characteristics, that it would only be the print version if there was no 07. And also that there was a discussion about the Program for Cooperative Cataloging Policy Committee would form a group to explore the single record approach in the context of other format records for other formats. CONSER standard record practices that are still under consideration, the identification of language expression if you have translations. For now, we will continue the CONSER standard record practice, but there will be a core element working group that will be formed before RDA is implemented to take a look at that. Also, the distinguishing uniform, or the uniform title, or the work title, the distinguishing work title. We will continue the current practice for now, and there's no consensus in terms of what to do with RDA. There was a general, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go over probably a couple minutes, and I do apologize for that, as I typically do. At the CONSER operations meeting, there was a general sense that when we were talking about what to do in RDA, if the practice in RDA was pretty much the same as what the practice had been under AACR2, and CONSER had already made a decision that the AACR2 practice really wasn't effective, then I think in a lot of cases we just made an outright decision that no, we weren't going to go forward with an RDA practice that we already knew from experience with AACR2 didn't work very well for serials. The uniform title practice that we have with the CONSER standard record right now, there really is no consensus yet within CONSER about whether that works really well. It works well from the perspective of the cataloger who's the production cataloger, not having to create it. There's still no consensus upon whether it provides enough use that we really should be using it in all cases of non-distinctive title. The data publication, there was actually, we're going to continue the CONSER standard record practice for now, which is you're not required to provide a 260 subfield C, but there was not even a consensus on whether the existing practice was good or not, because there are a lot of systems that are still using 260 subfield C as a limiting device. So that question is still up in the air. And again, when CONSER forms its core elements working group, they'll take a look at that element. One final issue, this isn't specifically a CONSER standard record element, but it just has to do with personal name main entry. It's an ACR2 practice. We had an LCRI that really limited the use of personal name main entry for serial records into these situations. We discussed this at the operations committee meeting, and what happened was this LCRI was not carried into RDA or into an LC policy statement in any form. So the result is that there are a lot more, under RDA there would be many more records which would have a personal name as part of the authorized work entry, as the authorized access point. So what we're going to do in terms of personal name main entry is continue the existing practice for now, which is that LCRI 211A2. Try to reframe that RI within the context of RDA so that it can be applied to serials and ongoing integrating resources within RDA. Ask the ALA JSC representative to ask them to add this clarification to RDA for serials, and reinstate the provision, basically some form of what you just saw in the last slide, make that a CONSER PCC best practice. So that's where we are with that specific issue now. Here are some resources that have to do with the CONSER standard record, and a couple articles that have been published about the CONSER standard record, including the one that I referenced earlier in Serials Review. Okay, so if you have any further questions, you can refer to these documents. And it's now, I'm finished with the official presentation. Again, I apologize for going a couple minutes over, and let me just take a quick look at any questions which have shown up in the meantime, and then we should be done. Oh, Barbara is, oh good, Barbara, okay. Sorry. I just got a question from a comment from one of the LC staff that Barbara Tillett will not have seen this presentation, so I don't have to worry about that. Okay, well, there's a question about, is there a website or listserv to find out when the single record approach guidelines will be clarified? No, not at this point. The single record approach guidelines are available from the CONSER website and from the PCC website. From both of those places. You might have to dig around a little bit, but you can find them there. I'm sure if there are any changes to the single record approach practice that they will be, if no place else, there probably will be something on Serialist. I would imagine there probably will be something on AutoCAD. And there will definitely be something up on the Program for Cooperative Cataloging website or the CONSER website. And I see there are no other questions, so I want to thank you very much for your patience in staying a couple extra minutes, and let me hand this back over to Cindy for a final wrap-up.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much. Even though you went a little bit long, we appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. You just know so much about all this stuff, and I marvel at it every day. Thank you also to our attendees. The Elect CE Committee hopes that you found today's session helpful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please spend a few minutes filling it out and return it because your comments are valued and they help the committee plan other events. I'm going to change my slide now. And I want you to see that we have some more webinars coming up, some of which are RDA related. And if you're a serialist, you might be interested in the one on November 9th, which is the ISSN&U presented by Regina Romano-Reynolds. I urge you to register for that one. Suggestions for webinars and other continuing educational opportunities are welcome at any time. Please contact me at the address on the screen or submit a proposal for a webinar using the Alex Webinars page. Thank you to Jackie Samples for providing technical support for today's webinar, and again to Steve for providing content. We are delighted that you joined us this afternoon, that you stuck in for a few extra minutes with us, and we hope you will participate in another Alex webinar or another CE event soon. Bye-bye.